Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with two very special guests. Our first guest today is Emily Henry, and she's here to share with us her new book, Beach Read. If you're looking for a summer read to get lost in, the instant New York Times bestseller Beach Read is your book. Now, Emily writes stories about love and family for both teens and adults. She studied creative writing at Hope College and the New York Center for Arts and Media Studies, and now spends most of her time in Cincinnati, Ohio, and parts of Kentucky. So let's welcome to the show, Emily Henry.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh my goodness, what an honor it is to have you here. And congratulations, your book is a New York Times bestseller. I mean, how exciting is that?
It is mind-blowing. I didn't even really dream that it was a possibility until the day the list came out. I remember like 2 hours beforehand, probably I emailed my editor and was like, I don't know if this is kind of a kooky, like off-the-wall thought, but is there a chance that the book is going to hit the list? And if so, what time would we know that? And, you know, like, do you already know that it hasn't? Because maybe you could put me out of my misery. And it turned out that my whole team was sort of thinking that it might hit, and they're all a little bit superstitious. So they had not said a word about it. And then like 2 hours before the list came out, I kind of threw my hat into their ring and stressed them out a little bit by just asking point blank. And yeah, it was really wild. They all called me together on this huge group phone call to congratulate me. And it was, it was shocking. And I would actually say that probably it staying on a second week was more shocking. Like, you know, it's kind of the ultimate writer dream to hit that list, but to stay on it for a little bit was mind blowing.
Oh, I'm not surprised. I mean, this is a great read. I'm not surprised about that at all. You know, it's a great read. And I think a lot, you know, especially now, people are looking for ways to escape. And man, your book really provides that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, really, for me, it was an escape while I was writing it. I kind of wrote the book in my own personal pandemic. In a way, I mean, I just was very anxious at the time and fairly depressed and just sort of disillusioned about a lot of things that were going on in the world. And I just wanted to immerse myself in something that felt good and that felt like an escape and brought me some hope and joy. And so I really wrote it just because that was what I wanted to immerse myself in. And it was very strange to realize it would be coming out in this wild, off-the-wall climate. But it also kind of makes a weird sense in a way, just because, you know, like, this is what this book is for. This book is for comfort and for escape and for like just little pockets of joy when things seem really hard. And, you know, I'm really grateful that it can be that for people right now. That's a very strange and wonderful honor.
Well, I think everyone's going through their personal pandemic right now. Yeah. I mean, seriously, I mean, myself included, where we have days where we're stressed out and anxious. Yeah. And so why don't you share a little bit about what the inspiration behind writing this book was?
Yeah. So like I said, there was a lot going on in the world that just sort of had me feeling very pessimistic. And that was a big shift for me. I've always been sort of an optimist and a person who just really believes that things shake out how they're supposed to and all of that. And I was going through this time of just feeling like the world wasn't what I had thought it was or what I hoped that it was. And while that was going on, like I said, I really wanted to be immersed in this story that would make everything feel just a little bit better and that would help me sort of wrestle with the feelings I was having. But I didn't have any ideas whatsoever for a book. I had just turned in my second young adult novel. I published some books for teens before Beach Read. And I was very just wiped out. I had no ideas left, no characters left. My brain was just that desert scene with the tumbleweed blowing past. And so even though I really wanted to be working and wanted to be in this story, I had no ideas for a book. And whenever that happens, it's like the most miserable place for me to be in. I am a workaholic in a joyful way. I love writing. It's the best feeling in the world when you're just in a story and nothing else seems to hold your attention quite like what you're working on. Whenever I'm not able to work, it's very miserable for me. And I usually end up, without any like exaggeration, lying on the floor, just sort of groaning at the ceiling and trying to just think a story into existence. And that wasn't really doing anything, because it pretty much never does. And after a couple of days of that, I just had to accept that I was sort of locked up in a way that I hadn't been before, kind of the worst case of writer's block that I'd had, just I think from sheer exhaustion, really. And at that point, I was still so desperate to be telling this beachy, warm love story. I just wanted to be in a beachy, warm love story. And I kind of just made the executive decision to write a book about a writer with writer's block and see what happened. I figured if I just started with that point that I was in, maybe the story would unlock itself. I wasn't super optimistic about that, but I'd never, tried that very meta approach. And so I basically just started with that prompt of like, this is the kind of story I want to tell, this beachy, warm love story on the shore of Lake Michigan. And the way that I'm going to find the inroad into that is by creating this character who's a writer with writer's block. So at that point, I just basically started asking myself questions like, what would give a different writer, not me, but a different writer, writer's block? And because I knew I wanted it to be a love story at its core, it only made sense to me that she would obviously be a romance writer. And the thing that would cost you your belief in writing romance, or that would block you up, would be kind of losing your belief in love. So that was really just the first kernel, and it came together far more easily than I could have imagined. Probably the easiest book I've ever written, because it was just so easy to ask myself the question of like, what obstacle would get in her way next? What would be the thing that makes it even harder to write? And that was how I wrote probably the first half of the book, at least, was just about putting new obstacles in front of her, and seeing how she dealt with them. So it was a very meta experience for me, but it was a real delight. And like I said, it just was sort of this blissful, easy process that I would love to replicate someday, but don't expect to.
Well, I think you touched into something a lot of writers and creative people experience, is that block. And my gosh, at the way that you wrote, it's just so captivating. Like, people like, hey, I can really relate to this. I'm having this going on in my life right now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm relieved to hear that. And I've heard that several times, and it's always sort of a relief, because I think when you make any kind of art or have any sort of project that's your passion, it can be this really solitary experience, and you know how it feels to you, and you know all of the pieces of it. But even if you have friends who are in the same fields, the same community, you don't necessarily know that it's the same for everyone. And and to an extent, it's definitely not the same for everyone. But I think the biggest probably concern that I had with the book was like, how are other writers or other artists going to feel about this? Are they going to think that this is genuine? Is this like how I find out that I'm super weird and the way that I do things is like quote unquote wrong and doesn't work and all of that? And it's been really nice how many writers have specifically reached out to me to just tell me that they really connected with January's story and with her whole creative process and all of that. Because a lot of times you don't really know, and there's always that little blip of imposter syndrome waiting to convince you like that you're the fraud and everybody's going to see through you if they look close enough. So yeah, I mean, it's that has been really encouraging and funny to me, to just get to talk to so many other writers who I didn't really know or didn't know at all before this, and kind of commiserate about all of the things that the main characters actually commiserate about in the book.
Well, I love how you took what really had you stuck, the writer's block, and then use that as the basis for your book, to really kind of use that as your creative, expression out. And I think that's why so many people really appreciate this, because there's so much authenticity with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think that could have gone so badly. I think anything that has a meta element has the potential to feel super gimmicky. But like I said, once I got into the book, I really was lost in the story. So it didn't just stay this clinical examination of writer's block for me by any means. It was very much like it became the character's story once I was in it. But that was the perfect inroad in, and I don't know if I'll ever have that kind of experience again. But yeah, I don't know. It was really interesting to take that meta route and see how that could actually unstick me and let me write again.
Or perhaps this is something that you're teaching people how to, look at what it is that, kind of keeps them where they're at and using
Right.
that to propel them forward. I actually think it's real empowering.
Yeah, I totally do agree with that. I didn't think of it that way when I was writing it, but after the fact, it was so easy to look back and realize that by asking all of those questions of my main character, like obviously that helps me get unstuck. And I think, I've had minor spurts of writer's block since then. And now I think I'm a lot more self-aware and critical of it. I examine it instead of just giving into it or feeling miserable or letting the imposter syndrome creep up. It's much more like a process of investigating it a little bit and trying to figure out what exactly is going on. And I think with writer's block in general, for me, I've started to notice that there's this pattern of fear where it's like, I'll think that I'm bored with the story or I don't have any ideas or whatever. But really, there's just this fear that the book can't live up to that first image in your mind. And that, I think, is a thing that stops a lot of us from working on things that we really care about, or makes us not finish projects, abandon them halfway through, because we start to get in there and see we're building this thing from the ground up and it doesn't match up to how we envisioned it when we set out. And I don't know, I think realizing that was just general fear or anxiety has been really freeing to me too, because if that's all it is, there's really nothing behind it. It's just like a little sheet dancing in the wind that looks like a ghost, but it's really nothing. It's just like fear that you can't live up to your initial expectation, which maybe you won't, but the only way to know is to forge ahead.
So why don't we dive into Beach Read just a little bit? We're not here for spoilers, so no spoiler alerts. Everyone will have to pick up their own copy to enjoy this book. But you chose Lake Michigan as the setting for this. Was there a reason why you did that? Are you familiar with Lake Michigan?
Yeah, I went to college in West Michigan on the lake. And before going to school there, I didn't really know anything about Michigan. I don't think I'd ever even been to Michigan before showing up to, well, I went once to visit the school, but that was the first time. And I didn't really know anything about the Great Lakes. My family is originally from the West Coast, and then I spent most of my childhood in the Midwest, but not in Michigan, and just sort of in landlocked Ohio and Kentucky. So I wasn't really familiar before college with Lake Michigan or Michigan culture. And going to school there, I absolutely fell in love with the lake. And anybody who's from Michigan has very warm, affectionate feelings towards the lake, at least as far as I've met. I've never met a Michigander who doesn't have this deep passion for Lake Michigan. And I think it's sort of because it's, when you go, it feels very much like you're at the ocean. There's beach culture in these cute little towns. But it's sort of this, like, it's almost a secret because it is a regional destination more so than, the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. People from Michigan and from Wisconsin and Chicago and whatever will go on vacation to Lake Michigan, but it's not overrun with tourists. There's a little bit of tourism, but I don't know. It's kind of the best of both worlds because it really, like I said, has this beach culture that you would be probably surprised to learn about if you're not from around the area, but it never gets quite as crowded. It feels very clean. You don't have to worry about sharks. And yeah, I don't know. And I think the other thing about Lake Michigan that's so appealing to me is the fact that Michigan, for most of the year, at least Western Michigan, is very, very cold. And it snows a lot, and the lake freezes over, and it really looks like this Martian landscape. You can walk out onto the frozen waves and look down to where the water is not frozen. And it's surreal and sublime and beautiful. And I don't know, it's just this place that changes so much from season to season. And I think for January's story, like the reason that it makes sense for her story to happen there is because she's going through this transformation. And, you know, even though the story largely takes place in summer, there is a scene for the end of the book where she's at the lake in winter and kind of just like coming to terms with, I think it, you know, it's really a book about coming to terms with accepting the beautiful moments in your life alongside the ugly moments. And so having this kind of wild, vicious landscape as her setting that's very beautiful but unpredictable and changes so much even just through the course of a year, it wasn't necessarily an intentional decision that would kind of mirror her own internal arc, but I think that there is a very much a reason that she needed to be there for her story. And yeah, it's just a place I love. Aside from that, like, it's just a place I love that I missed and wanted to be, and knew well enough to feel like I could give this setting its what it deserved. And the town in the book is actually a fictional town, but it's very much based on an amalgam of these little West Michigan towns that I love, Saugatuck and Holland and Grand Haven, just really cute little, like, just the cutest little towns and beautiful beaches. So yeah, it was, I mean, there was a lot that went into it. Setting is something that really inspires me. And, you know, before I had any concept of the book itself, I knew that I wanted to be writing a story set on Lake Michigan.
Now, when you were writing Beach Read, did you go and visit Lake Michigan either before, after, during, you know, this whole experience?
I did not during, but I mean, you know, I still visit Lake Michigan on occasion. I'm trying to think. I actually had visited shortly before. I think the fall before. I wrote it sort of in the spring. And I think the fall before late fall, I had been up there to do a reading at my alma mater. So yeah, I do try to get up there still semi-regularly. But I didn't necessarily need to be there, especially because it was a fictional town. I was able to just draw from some of my favorite places and kind of build the town up around those places.
So why don't you share a little bit with us what your writing process was like when you were writing Beach Read? I mean, did you have like certain times during the day, or is it just whenever you could?
I am largely a morning writer, or at least for Beach Read, I've kind of started to see a shift lately where later in the afternoon, early evening is better. But in general, I've always preferred to work in the morning. I found that if I do much before I start writing, I lose my energy. I lose my ability to make decisions, to think through plot points, all of that. I kind of need a fresh brain to do my best work in general. So usually, you know, my writing process really is I kind of wake up and just look at social media or play a game on my phone or something while I drink a cup of coffee. And then, you know, the fear sort of builds, this dread of what am I going to work on today? Is it going to go well? All of that, like just the fear of getting into the project. And then eventually I just pull the plug and I do it. With Beach Read, I didn't tell anyone what I was working on. It was very much this project that was just for me. And I almost didn't want to jinx it since I had really bad writer's block before starting it. So my husband knew I was working on something, but I didn't tell him what, and he knew better than to ask questions. And I wrote it very quickly. In general, I tend to draft very quickly and then revise fairly slowly. But I think I wrote the first draft in 3 or 4 weeks. Just rapid fire, very bad draft, very bare bones. A lot of the dialogue was there and not much else, probably, if I remember correctly. And I did this thing where I drew like a bar chart kind of thing. I just like drew a bar and I marked off like different word count levels along the bar. And every day when I had finished writing, I would fill in the bar with a red marker to just give myself like a visual to show myself making progress, because it's so easy when you're writing something that size to just kind of feel lost in it and not so sure you are capable of finishing it. So having that visual was very helpful to me. But I generally draft quickly. I don't really correct things as I go along. If I realize later in the book that a character needs to live somewhere else or have a different name for whatever reason or different job, anything like that, I usually just make comments in the document and I keep going. And when I'm finished, I'll go back and revisit everything. So yeah, it was a blissful, quick writing experience. And then I think, like I said, at the time I was publishing books for teens, and I didn't really know if this book was going to be something that anybody would ever want to read. And no one knew about it, so I didn't owe it to anyone. Nobody was waiting for it. And I set it aside for, I think, at least a year, probably a year and a half before I opened it back up and started reading it. It was like, I think this is actually pretty good. And at that point, the new wave of rom-coms in publishing had sort of started to build back up. And so it seemed like a much more viable book than it had when I actually wrote it. And so I started doing my own edits. And after a couple more weeks of working on it, I sent it to my agent at the time, who's since retired and I'm with a new agent. But she kind of went through some edits with me. And yeah, it was just kind of a long, drawn out process because I didn't even know if the book was a book, which, you know, every time I write a book, that's sort of how it feels. But especially for this one, it was like, I don't know if anybody wants to read this, even though this is exactly what I wanted to be writing.
Well, I love how in Beach Reads you also touch on parts of the publishing industry where there's a kind of a little bit of an angst in regards to different types of publishing that's done. And it's very interesting how some authors are feeling one way or another way in regards to different types of genre.
Yeah. I mean, coming from the world of young adult, I think that there's a really similar kind of condescension to young adult and to romance, to both those genres. Both those genres are dominated by women authors primarily, and we have largely female readerships. And because of that, there's a lot of, I don't know, there's just a lot of ways that people look down on the genres and malign them. So yeah, coming from young adult, I was familiar already with the way that those genres can be maligned. And I think it's sort of suspect that the two that you see that primarily happen with are categories that are largely written by women and read by girls and women. I think that is sort of, just a suspicious thing to realize. Like, why are the things that are interesting to girls and women innately seen as inferior? What is it about telling a story about a relationship of any kind that kind of relegates it to something that no boy or man would want to touch? I've seen that play out, and I'd watched it happen to romance authors too. And I had just barely started to scratch the surface of reading romance. And I was really surprised by the depth of the stories and by the tension and just the writing ability and everything, because it's something that I had seen happen. I had seen people kind of laugh about like silly women's books, essentially. And actually reading them and realizing how hard it must be to write that sort of book was really surprising to me, to just realize like, oh, this is kind of laughed at for no reason. And you know, there are just so many weird little quirks in publishing. The conversation that happens between the two main characters about women's fiction is perhaps obviously a conversation that happens between a lot of authors. And there's this weird thing about the women's fiction category, which is, on the one hand, it's great because somebody who wants to read a certain kind of book can go straight to that shelf in the bookstore and pick it up. And I will admit that when I'm in a bookstore, I look for the women's fiction section. That's something that I know this will be books largely written by women about women. But the strange other side of the coin is, why would that be called women's fiction when men's fiction isn't a thing? Like, why would we say if a book's written by a man, anyone can read it? If a book's about men, anyone can read it. But if it's written by a woman about women, and there's a love story especially in it, or an examination of sisterhood or motherhood or anything like that, we're going to put it off in a separate category because men won't want to read that. And I don't think that that's true. I think that that's socialized a bit for people to think that way. I don't think my husband had like basically ever even seen a rom-com before he met me. And now he loves them, and he reads all my books and loves my books, and he reads a lot of my friends' books. And yeah, it's a great disservice, I think, to everyone to just say that this whole gigantic shelf of books is only for half of the world. It just doesn't really make any sense. And like I said, I have kind of battling feelings about it because it's where I go. It's where I go when I'm in a bookstore. It makes it easy for me to look for a certain kind of book. But on the other hand, it does feel a little bit insulting to just know that there are people who won't read your book because of who you are and who your main character is. I mean, I think actually of my dentist. I was at my dentist who's fairly new to me, and he asked what I wrote, and I told him I write young adult novels and women's fiction. And he laughed and said, I guess I won't be reading any of your books. And first of all, I will say I'm glad for my dentist to not read my books. That's not something I'm looking for in a dentist, is someone who's reading my books. But it's also just kind of a funny thing to be like, why was he so comfortable saying that to me? Like, why? It strikes me as odd. And there's a conversation in the book as well that was pulled from real life, where January talks about how she was talking to one of her male writer friends and said what she wrote or what she worked on, what she was working on. And he said, whatever pays the bills, right? And that was an experience I had after I sold my first book for teens. I was talking to a friend of a friend, like very excited I'd finally sold a book. And he asked what it was about. And I told him, and he said, whatever sells the bills or whatever pays the bills, right? And it was this weird moment where I was so shocked that I kind of just nodded along and didn't challenge the idea. But later, I just thought to myself, why does he think that I don't care about what I do? Why does he think that that's silly? He hasn't read the book. I don't know. I mean, it's all marketing tool. It's all marketing tools. There's literary fiction as a category, as a genre. It's sort of silly too, because it's just saying this book is really well written. There's a lot that goes on, which is probably helpful from a reader's standpoint, but seems very strange from a writer's standpoint.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that with us, because I think a lot of times writers get this kind of feedback. And so it's nice to be able to hear, it's like, gosh, here you are, your book's a New York Times bestseller. Oprah Magazine's rated it as, best beach read of summer. So for somebody like that, I would just probably drop a book in the mail to him. No words needed,
Yeah, there is a little bit of a sweetness to like having that level of success with a book. I don't know. And that's the funny meta thing about it too, is, having January complain about all of these things. And then it was funny. I also had a very lovely, very unexpected review in the New York Times, which when that happened, that was before the list came out. And even that, I was just blown away and was like, this is one of my top 3 writer dreams right here. And I can't believe it's not just a horrible panning article. But when that happened, it was very funny and felt like a very ironic twist to just have my book about women's books not being taken seriously get this wonderful review in the New York Times, specifically in their romance, roundup, but still this wonderful review. And then it hit the list, and it was like, okay, maybe things are changing. Like all the people who I sort of poked fun at or teased a little bit in the book actually do seem to be taking notice of the book and respecting it and being very kind about it. And that was so encouraging and so surprising. And a little bit, it was a little bit like, oh God, what did I do? Like, why did I call them out like that and then watch them be so lovely about my book?
Well, do you know what? It says a lot. It says that people are really gravitating towards this book. Your writing style, again, is just phenomenal. I love.
Thank you.
I mean, it was really easy to read. So it's definitely a page turner, and congratulations on all the accolades of your book. My goodness,
Thanks. I really appreciate that. I'm very honored by every single kind thing that has been said, and surprised and pleased and really grateful.
Well, Emily, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your books and be part of your community?
they can follow me on Instagram is probably the best bet. My handle is at Emily Henry Wright. They can also find me on Facebook, but Instagram, and I'm on Twitter as well, but Instagram is the social media that I gravitate towards. It's the one that feels the most natural and the easiest to share glimpses of what I'm reading and what's going on in my life. And it's a really great place to connect with readers. I've been really surprised that this visual medium is the place that seems like the best fit for having conversations.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a really great conversation.
Well, thank you, Emily. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you, and of course, to talk about your new book, Beach Read. Beach Read's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers, and of course, you can get it on Kindle. Again, if you'd like to connect with Emily, you can. She's located on Facebook at emilyhenrywright.com and also on Instagram. Well, you want to stay tuned for our next special guest. We know that family is everything, but what if you discovered a trove of family secrets that changed everything you believed about yourself? Sometimes forgiveness takes a little bit of grace. Stay tuned for our next guest, Phoebe Fox. She'll be sharing with us her upcoming book, A Little Bit of Grace. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with our next special guest, Phoebe Fox, and she's here to share with us her upcoming book, A Little Bit of Grace. Now, we know that family secrets can unravel everything we believe about ourselves. Phoebe is here to share with us how a little bit of grace can go a long way. Now, Phoebe's been a contributor and regular columnist for a number of national, regional, and local publications, including The Huffington Post, Elite Daily, and She Knows. As a former actor on stage and screen, Phoebe has been dangled from wires as a mall fairy and was accidentally given a concussion from a blank gun. She also hosted a short-lived game show. She's been a relationship columnist, a movie, theater, and book reviewer, and a radio personality. So let's welcome to the show, Phoebe Fox.
Thank you so much for having me, Marianne. I'm so happy to be here.
What an honor it is to have you here. My goodness, I heard about this book and had to have you on the show. Everyone is talking about your book. As an author, you have to be so excited.
Thank you. I am, especially because this one had a really long journey to publication. So it's really nice. It comes out August 11th, and gosh, we're in the last month countdown, and I can't believe it's finally happening.
Oh my goodness. Before you know it, it'll be here, right?
Yeah. Before I know it, 13 years after I started it.
Oh, we're going to dive into that journey. But let's talk about the book's journey. Let's talk about your inspiration for this. Like, what inspired you to write this book?
Oh, it's sort of tied to the journey it had because this was the first. So I've written from the time I was a kid, from the time I knew how to write, like most writers, but I didn't know I could do it, full-length fiction and be a published author. So I did a variety of things. I was an actor. I was a journalist. And then about, I guess, 13 or 14 years ago, I thought, well, I'm going to try a full-length fiction, and sat down and wrote a really bad version of this book. It was very different. It was, so this story is about a woman who goes to meet a relative she never knew she had, a long-lost relative, and she finds herself on a tropical island with this extraordinary octogenarian matchmaker, viral relationship advice columnist, and uncovers a bunch of family secrets that lead her to have to wrestle with big issues of forgiveness. But what it started as was this kind of Hitch meets Cocoon wacky comedy about a bunch of older, like serious seniors, 80s and 90s, who wanted a final chance at love. And it wasn't that the premise was awful. It was that my writing was awful. So I probably rewrote it, I don't know how many times, 4 or 5. And then it just wasn't coming together. So I put it in a drawer and I worked on some other stories, and I had 4 books published. And then I just couldn't get some of these characters out of my head. So I went back and revisited them, and then it turned into this story. What inspired this one was a couple of things. I had a real Aunt Millie who my mom took care of. She was my great aunt, and my mom loved her, and I didn't know her that well, but when she came, my mom went and got her from Ohio and brought her to live near us so she could take care of her. And in the course of moving her, we found all these crazy family secrets in her apartment. Like, she was a wild woman, at a time when it wasn't okay to be a wild woman. She just lived this totally free life and was madly in love with one man for decades and never got to be with him. When my mom put her in an assisted living facility, she began to suffer from dementia. And even amid all of that, she would have her, evening toddy every night, and she'd flirt with all the men at the assisted living facility. And at like 80 something years old, she just decided, lifelong smoker, she decided, I think I'm going to stop smoking. And then she did. So she fascinated me, but her story broke my heart because she never got to be with her true love. So I wanted to give her a little bit of a happier ending and just kind of bring this extraordinary person to life. And then I was also in a personal place, like a lot of us, about 4 or 5 years ago, where there was some family stuff going on and some world stuff going on. And it felt very challenging to deal with some themes of forgiveness and rage. And I write to work stuff like that out. It's like my therapy. So I kind of brought all that into the story. And that's when it finally came to life. And I found the story that it is now.
It sounds like such a journey. And you know what? It's interesting. Most authors that I talk to, when they talk about their first draft, most of them go, gosh, it was pretty god awful. And then we go back through and we change it and change it and change it until it gets to a point where it's really this book that really flows.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of having to find the story, what it wants to be, especially if you're not an outliner, which I'm not. I sort of let the story and the characters guide where I'm going, and I have a vague idea of what I want to explore and the shape I think it'll take. But also, especially when we're first starting out, writing is, we all read, so we're all like, hey, I'm going to write too because I love books. I know how they go. And then you realize, oh my God, it's a really complex skill. And you're very bad at it until you learn that skill. Like anything, you wouldn't pick up a violin and try to play it. You have to be really bad at it for a while and practice. So I think that's why so many authors who become published still have those embarrassing books in the drawer. I just pulled mine out. Most people leave them where they are. And I'm like, I cannot leave it. Millie just really wanted to be in the book. So I gave her that.
Well, I love that because there's this real deep inspiration for this book to come forward. And I'm so glad you wrote this book. What an excellent read. And I'd love for you to, oh yeah, my goodness. I'd love for you to share with our listeners, just a little bit about your writing process. What was that like, going back and forth? Do you have like certain time during the day that you write? What does that look like?
Well, every writer's different. I do think the one constant for most of us is that you have to have some sort of a routine. A lot of, especially newer authors, we wait for the muse to come and kiss us. And I read a quote, I wish I could remember who said it, to the effect of, she will, but only if she knows where to find you. And so you have to be at a certain place in a regular way so that you sort of train that like any other muscle. It almost becomes habit. You sit down at your computer or with your notebook at this time on these days, and it doesn't necessarily have to be every day. It's not for me. I write every weekday morning. And during that time, you write, and you might write really bad stuff. I keep coming back to that. Like, I want everyone to know that, especially if you want to write, the thing you read has been through so many drafts probably, and it probably started off really bad. Like it's a process. And there's another famous quote, writing is rewriting. And it really is. You have to find the story and you have to really develop it and finesse it. So once I get it on the page, which is kind of okay, I'm going to be slightly gross here. There's a beautiful book by Brenda Euland called If You Want to Write. And it's a book about creativity. Specifically writing, but it's applicable to all creatives. And she says that your first draft, you should just vomit it up on the page. And I love that advice because I tend to, like a lot of authors, I tend to try to edit and critique as I go. And it really shuts down the creative part of you. If it's like having an editor hanging over your shoulder going, well, that's just terrible. Well, of course it's terrible. I have to do that so that I can make it better when you come into the room, editor. But for the writing part of it, I think you just have to let it out. So I just kind of try to get the story out as seamlessly as I can for the first draft. And then I really dig in on the second draft. And third and fourth and 20th and 50th. And that's when I start doing the fine tuning, really developing the characters, trying to understand what their motivations are, making sure that they really care. There's a clear goal and they care about what that goal is. And so the reader will care about what that goal is. It doesn't sound glamorous at all, does it?
Well, I think for writers, it just makes sense because you look at it, it's like this process of this book becoming. And when you got to this place where like, hey, you know what? I think I'm done. What was that aha moment for you?
Okay, here's a dirty little secret. I don't know if most writers will tell you, we never think it's done. I'm rereading it right now because, so you know how long the publishing process is. And this book got signed with my publisher, Berkeley Penguin, at the end of 2018, just to give you an idea how long the process takes. So we worked on edits and I've read it since then, obviously, but not for a few months because it's been in the bag for a while and just we're doing all the other production stuff. So I'm rereading it to just kind of make sure I've written two things since then. I want to make sure I'm grounded in it. And I'm like, oh my God, I want to go back and change all this stuff because it's never finished. And I think as you evolve as a person and as an artist and as a writer, you grow and you do become better and different and you want to go bring that to your past work. But at a certain time, you just have to step away. I knew this one was finished because so here's the rest of the long publication story. This was back in 2016 that I finished it and it was slated for publication elsewhere. And so I had a deadline and I am a deadline oriented girl. So that's when it was finished, when the deadline came. But I had, for personal reasons, I decided not to publish it with that publisher and pulled it back from them and then started all over again to find another publisher. So this one has actually been written for almost 5 years. That's why I'm so eager to get it out. I really love it. And I have been I think it's a good one for right now. I hope it's a good one for right now because as much as it deals with some really difficult things that are Well, first of all, I think it's stuff a lot of us are dealing with right now. I think a lot of us are maybe feeling some rage and anger that we don't quite know what to do with, especially for someone like me, which I always think, well, I'm not an angry person. Well, turns out I am. We all are. And so I think it's topical in that way. I think it's topical there's a lot of family stuff in it where you have the people that you love the most in the world, you may not always agree with, and they may not always approve of who you are. And that's hard. And so that's a main theme in the book. I think that's really topical, but it's also very filled with hope and love and forgiveness. And I think those are topical. And then, of course, the best part to me is it's set on this gorgeous tropical island in Florida that I invented, but it's kind of an amalgam of real places where I used to live, Fort Myers and a little island off the coast of that part of Florida called Pine Island. And so if nothing else, it's a virtual vacation when none of us can probably take a vacation.
I love that because it's so true. I think, we're dealing with family issues. We're kind of stuck in our four walls, it's in some way, shape, or form with our family members. And so, tensions are probably running a little high. And between learning maybe a new perspective on dealing with that or assessing, just where we're at, we can also have this really delicious escape as well.
Yeah. And gosh, I think we could all use that right now on a lot of levels. But yeah, it seems like more than ever, we've got all these sort of family frictions as a result of not just the quarantine, but, the kind of, I don't know, we're a very polarized world right now, and that can be hard within a family.
Everyone has someone who keeps a family secrets. When you were uncovering your own Aunt Millie's family secrets, what was that like?
They weren't so much family secrets as just, and I don't even know if they were secrets. It was just, I had seen Millie in this one light. She was my mom's elderly aunt whom she adored, and I didn't know her very well, but when, she was beginning to suffer from dementia when I met her. So she was just kind of sweet, funny, wacky person, and I enjoyed her, but I didn't know her very well. And then, my mom was telling me about this whole life she had lived, and that was fascinating to me, especially as younger people. And I was probably in my early 20s then. I think we think that the older generation, I don't know, we kind of like you never think your parents existed before they were your parents. Mm-hmm. I think we forget that people have these rich, full lives. And in some cases, they are extraordinary. And Millie never married. She never had children. But I just found it fascinating that in a time when it probably wasn't okay to live life on your own terms as a single woman, she was doing it kind of unapologetically. So I really loved that about discovering that about her, but also bringing that into my Millie character, who didn't really come to life until I made that a big part of who she became.
I love that. Did you have difficulty writing about her experiences, or was it all just kind of just flowed when you were doing that process?
I did have difficulty at first because I didn't want to use her exact experiences, and I don't think I knew what the fictional Millie's experiences were. And then I met, so Millie's an amalgam of a few people, and then I met a woman whose life experience closely mirrors Millie, and there's a big reveal in the storyline, so I don't want to say any more than that. But that really brought her to life for me. Once I understood what the secret was and her reason for having to keep it and what happened to her and the family, she was so easy to write. Between that story and my Millie's personality, the real Millie's personality. And then this sounds crazy. I was at a show once and there was a performer who was absolutely wonderful and unbelievably funny and personable and warm. And I thought, oh, that's who Millie is. And so she's also kind of loosely based on that performer.
I absolutely love that. Oh my goodness. You look at all this and it's just like, wow, how amazing, because you really intertwine such a phenomenal character and storyline as well. And so
Thanks.
Let's talk about the protagonist a little bit, Grace. Is she based off anybody?
Grace is the me I could have been in some ways. She's also, she was hard to write because she's not me in many ways. She's kind of a good girl. She is family is everything for her as it is for me. And duty and responsibility are strong for her. So she winds up, rather than following the life she kind of dreams of living, which is to go travel and figure out what she wants. Her father leaves her mom. Her mom goes into a depression. She stays home to take care of her mom. And then she takes over the family estate planning business, which isn't really her passion. And literally marries practically the boy next door, which is part of her. That was part of her dream. This is the love of her life, and she's madly in love with him. So she's happy in the life she lives. But I think she doesn't realize how much of herself she's marginalized and compartmentalized until she meets Millie, who just lives totally out loud and really joyfully. And she's a complete free spirit and manages to infuse Grace with some of that. So in the course of the story, Grace begins to question things I don't think she questioned. I guess that's the core of her, that she always, this is what you do. This is family. She grew up in a small town in Missouri, and this is the family business. And these are the things you do. And this opens up her world a little bit, even while it undermines a lot of what she believed about her family. So she has to find a way to reconcile she loves them deeply. So she's got to reconcile that with all these realizations about it's okay for her to maybe figure out what she wants. And in the middle of all this, which sounds super heavy, it's actually a very humorous story. I probably should have said that earlier. Humor is one of the ways I deal with, everything. Especially hard things. And so that's a really prominent feature of the story.
So we've got Grace and Aunt Millie, and then you talked about also, this place that you created, Cypress Key, the island that's kind of loosely based off of some places you visited in Pine Island. And I love how that just kind of adds to that color of the story, because, you talk about, Pine Island being like this artist, hippie kind of community. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that.
I love that you said color, because that's the first thing I think of about that whole area. I should put it on my website. In my newsletter, I just posted some real pictures from Pine Island, and it's like sherbet colors everywhere. It's the buildings and the sky and the ocean, and the sand is really white and beautiful there. And then you've got the foliage, the palm trees, and then these lurid trees that seem like, when I first moved to Florida, I thought this is a set, because you've got these crazy purple trees and orange trees. It looks like Dr. Seuss. It's just this constant feast for the eyes. And I deliberately brought Grace there in the middle of a Missouri winter. So she goes kind of like Dorothy from this monocolor world to just color everywhere. I fell crazy in love with Florida, Fort Myers particularly, the first time I went there, and I moved there for 7 years. I never lived on Pine Island, but they used to do art gallery nights every month, where you would come onto the island and just wander from gallery to gallery, and there'd be jewelry and art. I put some of that in the story. And then it was an island it's a very sort of, it was not a planned island in the way that some neighborhoods and areas are, so you get a bit of a homogenous look to them. Pine Island was like, there's a Florida spirit. There's this Florida soul that is just pretty much, you do your thing. And so I think it was settled by a bunch of free-spirited hippie artist Florida people like that. So you may have, a stately mansion-looking thing next to a house built out of seashells, and a big pink stucco adobe building, or cracker house, or, the variety is just a feast for the eyes. And amid all of this, you've got mango trees and fresh mango stands. And this is all in Florida, it sounds like another world. And you've got, it's bordered by mangroves. I'm not sure if you know what those are. I didn't till I moved there, but they're these like really interwoven, viney looking, branchy things. And that's how new islands are formed. I think that's how Pine Island was formed, where they kind of start to grow and cling together, and then sediment clings to them. And little by little, the island grows on that, but the edges are always mangroved up. So it's kind of gothic looking and otherworldly. It's just a feast for every sense. Everything smells like gardenia and orange blossom and ocean.
Oh, that sounds perfect. I think anyone that's been to Florida, it does feel like a movie set, you know? It's its own little world, you know?
Parts of it, yeah. And especially the islandy or the farther flung parts of it, it just has its own spirit to it. And it's part of, I think, what makes Florida so unique and often the butt of the Florida jokes, because it's quirky, but it's quirky in what I find to be really interesting, cool ways.
So what inspires you now to write? Because now that a little bit of grace, I mean, it's been a project that's taken up a lot of your, like mind, body, soul for so many years. What are you working on now?
That is an excellent question. I finished another story that's also going to come out with Berkeley next year called The Way We Weren't, which is a little bit, it's not quite as light as A Little Bit of Grace. It's about a woman who has a difficult miscarriage that kind of causes her to question her decades-long marriage, and she flees sort of in a miniature nervous breakdown. And an old, bitter hermit who lives at the beach in Florida who finds her passed out on the sand behind his house. And they begin this unlikely partnership that winds up with both of them having to face some pretty dark family secrets they both have. Big on family secrets. And they also have to find a way to help each other heal. That one was harder to write, and it also took a long time, but it meant a lot to me. And then I wasn't sort of, I have to, as I said, the way stories start for me is not like I think of characters or I think of a plot. I literally have a thing I want to work through, like this thorny personal thing I'm thinking about. With Grace, it was forgiveness and anger and what you do with those things. And it was a bit of that for The Way We Weren't also. Those are actually themes I work with a lot. And so I've just started working on one I'd put away for a while that I don't quite know what it's going to turn into yet, but it's similar. A woman comes back to her hometown that she hasn't been to in 15 years and left under very unpleasant circumstances for the funeral of her stepfather. And go figure, family secrets are revealed. And there's just a whole bunch of family dynamic stuff that happens in that one. But I also, I'm going to put this in air quotes you can't see. My day job is as a book editor. Lucky enough to work with books all the time. And I just released a nonfiction book for that called Intuitive Editing, Creative and Practical Ways to Revise Your Own Writing. So I've had my head for such a long time in this factual nonfiction how-to mindset that it's funny to jump back to fiction now and get back in that storyteller's mindset where I think it's a little looser, freer, more creative. And I know exactly what I want to say in a nonfiction. In a fiction, I'm kind of finding my way as I go. And so I'm exploring it. And it's, my husband thinks this sounds somewhat mentally questionable, but I always tell him that I don't know what's going to happen. They just come on stage and I just watch and see what's going to happen to them.
That's a common thing you hear with fiction writers where they tell about how the characters really have a life of their own and they have no idea what the characters are going to do the next day.
It sounds super weird, doesn't it? But it's true.
Sense, though, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's half the fun of it. I do know authors. So there's a truism among authors that you're either a pantser or a plotter. And plotter's just what it sounds like. You outline it in advance and you fairly closely adhere to that. And a pantser is someone who does it by the seat of their pants. And it winds up in a whole bunch of, for me anyway, unusable words. For every 85,000 word novel I write, I've probably got about 30 to 50,000 words that got cut because it was me finding my way. So it's a very inefficient way to write, but to me, it's also the fun and creative way to write because I always say if it's like going on a road trip and you have every route mapped out and every stop mapped out and how long you're going to stay there and you can get there that way, but it doesn't have a lot of the joy of travel versus getting in the car and going, okay, I know I want to end up in California, but I don't know how I'm going to get there. We'll see. And to me, that's a lot more fun.
Yeah, you have such a great way of writing. I'm sure people, when they pick up your book, they're just like, oh my gosh, they dive right into it like I did.
Oh,
And they
thanks.
really you just feel captivated by it. And I have to ask, for our listeners and our readers, what message do you want them to take away from A Little Bit of Grace?
Oh, I love that question so much, Marianne. Wow, I think authors always want readers to take something away, and the beauty of art is they'll take what they take. But what I think is in my heart is that, first of all, I would like them to realize that you can be true to yourself and continue to love yourself, even when the people you love may not fully accept who you are. And just to know who you are and own it and not be ashamed of that and just live the life you want to live. I've been obsessed lately with I bet you know this list. It's the top 5 regrets of the dying, assembled by a palliative care worker. Have you heard of this?
Yes, I have. That's actually a great book.
Oh my gosh, it's beautiful. And I have the list of just the 5 things printed out. And one of them is, I wish I'd had the courage to be true to myself. These are the 5 things she says she has heard over decades in palliative care from people on their deathbed. And that really hit me hard. I think a lot of us, this is part of the inspiration of Grace too, is this, it's admirable to feel a sense of responsibility to the people that you love and to want to live up to, what is expected of you in many ways, your duty, your responsibility, your love for other people, your legacy, your family legacy, all that's powerful. But I also think, so what can sometimes get lost is the courage to be true to who you are. Like one of the most basic ways I think about that is with creativity itself. I think it's a human instinct and we're all born with it. We play make-believe, we color, we do art, we write as kids. And then for whatever reason, so often something tells us to stop doing that, whether it's shame or embarrassment or, put away that childish thing or a message from outside or an internal message. Somebody laughed at something you did, who knows? And so we shut that part of ourselves off, and you meet people who say, oh yeah, I'm not creative at all. And I'm like, of course you are. We all are. Do you cook? Do you love to garden? Everything it's human. It's how we express ourselves as humans. So I kind of hope people take that away from it. And also just one of the themes I was really working with in this was how to forgive things that feel unforgivable from people that you love. And I hope that that's something readers take from it, especially right now. I feel like that would be comforting in the current world.
Yeah, definitely with the current climate we have. Well, Phoebe, where can our listeners connect with you and learn about your books and be part of your community?
Probably the best place is to go just to my website, for starters, phoebefoxauthor.com. And on there are all my social media links, but mostly everywhere, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, it's Phoebe Fox Author. So you can find me that way.
Well, Phoebe, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Marianne, I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Well, thank you, Phoebe. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you. And of course, to talk about your upcoming book, A Little Bit of Grace. A Little Bit of Grace is available for pre-order. You can also connect with Phoebe on her website at phoebefoxauthor.com for more information. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.